I'm Jamie S. Rich, and this is Back to the Gutters.
I like to use these Pentel pocket brushes.
Yeah, it's a beautiful book. I use a Winsor Newton Series 7. I love comics, so I was
Today on Back to the Gutters, we are in the home of Sierra Hahn, editor at Dark Horse Comics. Basically, if you're reading some of the cool books at Dark Horse, you're probably reading a book by Sierra Hahn. So thank you, Sarah, for sitting down and talking to us today.
Thank you, Jamie.
Basically, you began working at DC Comics, correct?
Yeah.
And you're working, though, on publicity.
Yeah. So I had started there now about 10 years ago, and I was there for 2 years working at Vertigo doing PR. Well, working at DC Comics, but I mostly focused on Vertigo. Did some work on Mad Magazine and some of the Wildstorm stuff, and then assisted David Hyde on a lot of the big event stuff for the DCU.
So where did you come from that you ended up in comics? Was that your goal to work in comics, or was that kind of just where your route ended up?
It's kind of where my route ended up. Like, I studied psychology and English Lit in college, and at the end of the end of my college tenure, I thought, I think I want to work in publishing and I want to do editing. And I kind of looked around to see if there were any graduate programs that would help segue me into that career. And I lived out here in Portland, Oregon. I was working 7 days a week at a clothing store and at a coffee shop, and I just needed to figure out something new to do and how to really start my career, because I spent, at that point, 5 years doing my undergraduate, and it wasn't sending me in any one direction in Portland. So I found this program at Columbia University. It's a publishing program through their journalism school. And through that, I ended up meeting the head of Warner Brothers Publishing at the time. I told him that I was a big comic book fan, and that I was curious about what that editorial process looked like. And he said, let me put you in touch with Paul Levitz at DC Comics. And I was like, essentially you go to this really great program that's incredibly informative, but you meet all of the top people in publishing and you say a word to them and they connect you to the next person you need to see, which happened to be the person running DC Comics. So Paul,
yeah, you went right to the top.
Yeah, and I was really lucky. So Paul said, I hear you're interested in comics. What titles are you interested in? And I wrote this letter about all of the Vertigo titles that I loved. And he was like, well, you shouldn't be talking to me. You should be talking to Karen Berger. And so Karen invited me to come in for the day and talk with her and sort of have an informal sort of interview. So I could just ask her about the process of editing comics and acquisitions and sort of tell her how much I loved all of the work that she's done and what she's done for comics at large, creating Vertigo. But I was also an early Amethyst reader, and she was an editor of that title when I was like 7 years old.
Oh, I didn't realize she edited that.
Yeah.
I remember that.
And I ended up finding all of that out, and it was like, oh, you're the best. So having that informal interview with Karen really did change my life. Because after my program ended at Columbia, I had interviewed with a literary agency. I had interviewed with Condé Nast, which is a magazine publisher. And Warner Brothers Human Resources called me as I was at the airport to come back to Portland and said, we have a position in our PR department, and Karen Berger recommended that we get in touch with you, even though we understand you want to work in editorial. Is this something you'd be interested in? So I just jumped at that opportunity, met David Hyde, somehow convinced him that I could be comfortable cold calling people and being social, because I'm at that time wasn't a super outgoing person. I always thought about publicity and PR as being more socially outgoing and more gregarious than I was. And David understood that I was passionate about the medium, so he took me on.
Was Amethyst, though, your gateway drug into comics, or how did you find comics as a kid?
I mean, I think it was. My oldest brother, I have two brothers, my oldest brother, Carlton, was a big comic book fan, and so he would go to the comic book store weekly, and I thought Carlton, my brother, was like the coolest person ever. And so I would accompany him to the comic book store and then find what things I loved. And I loved purple at the time, amethyst, purple, princesses. So I was like, I'm all over this.
They were waiting for you to find it.
Pretty purple things. And then I loved the Muppet Babies. That was a comic, right?
Yeah.
I'm like,
Marvel.
and then kind of anything he read a lot of X-Men, and he read a lot of Robotech. So I kind of sneak into his stash and try and read these things. I was 7, so I'm not sure I was reading too coherently what was going on in these comics, but I fell in love with the medium. I appreciated the medium. I appreciated being something that was important to my brother and having this kind of journey with him. Yeah.
So how did you jump from publicity at DC to editing at Dark Horse Comics?
I still always wanted to be on the other side, working on editorial and on that creative side and working with people to tell their stories. And Scott Alley had come out to New York for New York Comic Con. It was maybe the second New York Comic Con, first or second New York Comic Con.
Right.
And he had been in touch with a friend of mine who worked at Vertigo about some possibilities, and my friend had said, hey, my friend Sierra happens to be from Portland, this area at least, and she wants to get into editing, so you should get in touch with her. So I had an informal meeting with Scott during the New York Comic Con. It was after hours, I wasn't on the clock. And Scott kind of made me an offer I couldn't refuse. It was the launch of the Buffy line. I think there were maybe 2 issues of the new Buffy season 8 comics coming out. He said Brian K.Vaughn's going to be writing the second arc, and that's when you're going to be coming in. And I already knew Brian and loved Brian. I watched Buffy since it started on television in like 1997. I was like, I get to work with Joss Whedon. I get to work with Brian on this creative side of things. It was also just as they were starting the Umbrella Academy, so I was going to get to work with Gerard and work with Gabriel. They were just launching MySpace Dark Horse Presents. I was going to work on this anthology. So it just seemed like a lot of editorial opportunities that I couldn't pass up. So that's kind of how that happened.
Well, because now you're like you're basically the full editor on all the Joss Whedon, the Buffyverse, the Angel and Faith books, and the Buffy the Vampire Slayer season 10 you're on now.
Yeah.
What's that like? How do you manage that kind of thing? Like, what's the involvement of Joss, and how do you bring all of that stuff together?
I mean, it's nuts. It's surreal at times.
I imagine he's not always easy to get a hold of.
Yeah, and he is really responsive. I try and be respectful of his time. I mean, with season 8, he was really, really involved. And it was an incredible moment, an incredible experience. And he's had such great success with Avengers and sort of spearheading a lot of this stuff that's going on with the Marvel entertainment side of things. And he still is available to us. When we outline season 9 or we outline season 10, he's in the room with us saying, this is the story arc, this is the journey of these characters. He's sharing ideas with us alongside Chris Gage, who's writing Buffy, or Jane Espenson, who's not writing any of Buffy this season, but she's been writing the show the entire time.
Right.
They all come together because they love these characters so much that they continue to contribute to the mythos of these characters. So even though Joss isn't doing the writing at this point, he's still very involved in what's going to happen and how it's going to play out. And everything that we do, he sees it, he approves it. If I'm bringing on a new artist, like Megan Levins from Madame Frankenstein.
Never heard of her.
I send him samples of her work and say, this is the person I want to work with, this is the part of the story that she's going to be involved in, and if he gives me the thumbs up or the thumbs down, and he approved her art, so we can move forward with that. And that's kind of the level of his involvement at this point.
So what was the first thing you were given to sort of run with solo, or that you brought in that was like your book?
I feel like, if I can recall correctly, like the first thing that I was kind of set free on was MySpace Dark Horse Presents. So Scott, Allie, and I, who's our editor-in-chief now, we worked on that together, and then it became kind of my own project. So that's the one where I really grew and learned the ropes, and it was really tough. Working on an anthology is really difficult.
Terrible, yeah.
And when you've worked there for maybe 6 months and then that's your first big one, it really is like do or die.
Well, that was also crazy revolutionary at the time, that you guys were putting original content on MySpace with MySpace.
And it was free.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that was like, they were the biggest thing. This was pre-Facebook, so like MySpace was the place.
Yeah, we did some really cool stuff with it. I'm really proud of the work that we did there.
But did you do Gerard Way's True Lives of the Fabulous Killjoys?
Yeah, yeah. So Scott and I were originally going to work on that together, and then the book got delayed. And then Gerard ended up making an album that was sort of based off of the high concepts of what that comic was going to be. And it was a project that he was co-writing with his friend Sean Simon. It was something that they had come up with together. And so a few years had gone by, or maybe a year or two after that Killjoys album came out from My Chemical Romance, that we were able to revisit it and say, well, what is the story now? Like, if the album is this story and the music videos are this story that we originally thought we were going to tell in the comic, like, where do we go now? And I think what worked out really well is that the comic became about this little girl that you see in the music videos that the songs are about. And that's what Sean Simon and Gerard Way ended up writing about, and I was able to oversee that.
Because the thing is, you work on these projects where you got Joss Whedon, who works in TVs and movies. You got Gerard Way, who's lead singer of My Chemical Romance. He's a solo artist now. So you're working on these projects with people who aren't like really in comics, but they also encompass this larger thing. And it's not licensed like you're working on, say, RoboCop. You're working on like a creator-driven thing. It seems like a special skill set.
Yeah. It definitely is, because I know that I find myself being assigned more of like, and this person who has never written a comic wants to do it, and they're like, Sierra can do that. She knows how to teach people how to write comics. And I'm like, I'm not so sure about that. With mixed results, I'd say.
You're doing fine. Would you say that's a primary function as an editor, that you're like looking at what this person wants to do and helping them find the best path to do that?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think it's with everything, be it Buffy, be it Killjoys, where they are both things that had a life before I came on board. It's, for me, how do I work with a writer to figure out how to make it new and make it original and make it accessible to anyone? Because watching a music video or listening to an album or watching a TV show is a much different experience than sitting down with a comic book. And it's not for everybody. I want it to be for everybody. How can I make it for everybody? How can I make it for the TV show fans or the listeners? So that's kind of what I have to focus on with those particular books.
What about something, when you say working with Brian Wood, who you knew from Vertigo, but he comes to Dark Horse and he has this multi-year project, The Massive, which is like a future post-climate change apocalypse story. Like, how do you then wrangle something like that? How do you go about working with a writer to realize that vision?
As we go along, be it Brian or another writer, especially with something that big, you can see them sort of veer off the trajectory that you, as the editor, I have this platform and I'm following that and saying, how do I get the writer to come back to what it is that they were telling me or what the core of their story is? And if I see them veer off, I want to drive them back to that. Otherwise, I don't know where we're going, and that I'm sort of blind.
Right.
And that sort of hinders my ability to be an effective editor if I don't know where we're going, because I'm just going to ask a ton of questions. And I think with The Massive, Brian and I had that pretty early on, where the story started going in one direction. I was like, why is this happening? What is this person doing? What motivates them? What's going on? And that Brian was like, do you not like my story? What, you don't trust me? And I was like, I'm only as good as you allow me to be, and you have to give me information. And if I have that information, I can help you as a writer focus on that through line. And if you deviate from that story, that's fine, only if I know
you're doing it for a reason.
That you're doing it for a reason. And that connected with Brian. And so ever since then, we were able to sort of just keep up as the story was changing and evolving, where it was going to go. So then we knew what we were doing. And even if it changed, I knew pretty early on what the emotional core of that story was. And I'm an editor who is all about sort of editing that emotional core. I want really strong characters. I want characters who are going through a journey, who have evolved or changed, or if they haven't changed, we have a clear sense of why they haven't.
Do you find it difficult giving feedback? Like when I was an editor, I was very confident about story notes and writing notes, but because I couldn't actually tell you how to draw something, I couldn't give you any practical inking advice. Did you ever find it difficult having to communicate that way and say, well, this doesn't look good and I can't tell you how to make it look better?
Yeah, absolutely. I think maybe in the last 2 years, I've gotten a lot more comfortable talking about what works in the artwork and what doesn't. And I think I probably still suffer from the language of it, talking about perspective especially.
Yeah.
Oh, brutal. But I think the thing that I struggled with the most, and I think most editors have struggled with the most, is talking about color.
Yeah.
The vocabulary of color has been something that I've always struggled to articulate, and to be able to look at a panel or a page and say, this isn't working, or this image that's in the foreground doesn't pop enough, or it looks too muddy. You start learning these things.
Right.
It's too muddy, but it's too muddy can only carry you so far, especially when you're working with someone who's maybe new to coloring, and they just want to take a lot of beautiful neutral tones and put them on a page, because if it was an outfit, it would harmonize. But if you're trying to tell a story and you're trying to give something dimension, it doesn't work.
Yeah. Amethyst was an entryway for you. For a lot of people, in ElfQuest was a book like that. So what's it like then coming to such an influential property and bringing it back to a new audience?
I think when I first met the Peonies, I was a huge fan of ElfQuest growing up, and I went on this camping trip and I read it in the car, and then I got car sick and I threw up in a Capri Sun box, which leaked all over the carpet of the car. And they were like, "It's great to meet you. So you're our editor. Great."
You're gonna vomit all over.
But I was like, it's a compliment.
Yeah.
Like, it was worth getting sick for.
Well, unless they still trigger that in you, like, I'm reading ElfQuest.
So actually, when Mike Richardson wanted to bring ElfQuest to Dark Horse, I was a huge advocate and supporter of doing that, because it was something that was beloved to me as a kid, but another gateway for me to appreciate comics.
Well, how did you get then involved? Like, how did you become the person?
I think part of it is that I was like, I'm the biggest fan. I'll do it. And part of it's that, like, I really wanted to pay respect to the material, because it was so influential for me, just as a reader and as a fan, to comics, to just that sort of like epic long storytelling. It has elements of sort of Lord of the Rings, and I think people who love Bone would really love ElfQuest.
So as an editor, is that important to you? Do you want to create the kinds of experiences that you had as a young reader for new readers?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in my relative short time, although it feels long, working in comics, I recognize a need to create material that engages young readers and young audiences. I think it's a great tool for literacy, engaging people who might not be interested in reading a prose book can read something that has the sequential narrative with these beautiful drawings, with these really dense and lively stories alongside them. And I've known a lot of people as a child or as an adult who didn't read a lot until they read comics, and that was a segue for them to read prose literature, and now they can read both and enjoy them equally and appreciate both mediums for what they do artistically. And so ElfQuest is part of that, and my desire to sort of create kind of a world in Dark Horse where we're really pushing a line of books for kids and for young adults. And I want to bring in that sort of younger demographic so that they grow with us and evolve with us as a publisher, but also as just readers.
So you think we covered it? Did we get everything?
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you for spending time with us and for letting us into your process and your world.
Yeah. Thank you for inviting me. Cool.
All right.
Thanks.